Forum. So we will call our meeting to order. I'm going to ask Senator Williams if he'll open up with a prayer.
Let us pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you again for the many blessings and opportunities that you've given us all. I thank you again for our men and women in blue and our men and women in harm's way in the armed forces. Please bless them and protect them. Give us strength, give us courage, give us knowledge to carry out the duties of this great state of Georgia, and give us level heads, and give us all the courage and the patience and the strength. In thy name we pray. Amen.
Thank you, Senator. Welcome back. It seems like it's been a while since we've had an opportunity to visit in this committee. We have on the agenda this evening two pieces of legislation that we wish to consider. You have it on the agenda: Senate Bill 355 by Senator Robinson and Senate Bill 358 by Senator Burns. I'm going to ask Senator Robertson if he would provide presentation for SB 355.
Point of order, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir. Our chair recognizes the senator from Savannah.
We have no notebooks on this.
Well, let's get that cleared. Let's get that taken care of.
I think you starting now.
We'll hold until you get a full set of information, Senator. Thank you for that. We'll get this administrivia organized and move. Well, you know, it probably had to come up I-16 and it got caught in that traffic down around Jonesboro. Isn't that what happens to you, Senator?
It happens to me all the time.
Well, I'm glad the notebook finally arrived from Savannah. If you would, as you look at the agenda, you will see that SB 355.
Tyrone, I didn't get one yet. Is it Tyrone?
Yes, it's Tyrone.
Oh, thank you.
All right, now we got Tyrone covered, Savannah covered, Augusta covered. We've even got Catala covered. That's good. Senator Robertson, if you would please share the input from SB 355, your mic number, sir. Chairman, there you go.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for allowing me to present from my seat. I'm looking at Senate Bill 355 LC 560021. Mr. Chairman and committee members, I don't think any of us will deny the amount of confusion that the state of Georgia and the citizens that live here have suffered since the elections of 2016. I think we remember right after that election, there were all talks of fraud, voter fraud, ballot stuffing, ballot box stuffing, and all kind of accusations made. These accusations at that time, we were told that our Secretary of State at the time had manipulated the elections, and our citizens were in an uproar, and there was a polarization amongst citizens that we had not seen in my lifetime when it come to elections. And then 4 years later, in 2020, we saw it again, even greater. Our constituents' confidence in our elections were absolutely cratered. The state's response to these citizens has been weak at best. The 180 members of the House and the 56 members of the Senate have done the best job we could to go out and try to restore the confidence in the voters. And the men and women who send us here to carry out what they think is their business and to manage their money, their tax dollars responsibly and in the best way possible. But still, each and every day, we are all flooded, whether it be text messages, whether it is emails or letters, of citizens still concerned about the integrity of our elections. SB 202 that we fought for and passed just a couple of years ago went a long way in correcting some of these problems, but we still have a ways to go. And I'm going to tell you, what we do not need to do is attempt to change horses in the middle of a race while we are solving the problems that have been around since 2016. And so last year, an initiative was taken to bring in something that is commonly called ranked choice voting into Georgia. This has been an extraordinarily successful campaign throughout the country. It is a well-funded campaign with lobbyists in all states attempting to do this. What they have succeeded in doing is putting ranked choice voting in a lot of municipalities. And I want to be clear, ranked choice voting is not new. Ranked choice voting was around in the early 1900s. And because of issues related to ranked choice voting, it went away. And then later in the, I believe, if I'm right, it's going to be in the late 70s, possibly early 80s, the discussion started again. And in the early 2000s, ranked choice voting was brought back. We saw some of the chaos associated with ranked choice voting and the New York mayor's race, where it was over 15 days before the citizens of New York knew who their mayor was going to be because of the process used to count ranked choice votes. And if you've never seen a ranked choice vote ballot, it looks much like, in some races, like the lottery card that you pick up at the Circle K with all the bubbles on it. You have many, many choices, and there is a certain way you have to go through to rank your choices, whether there are 3 candidates on the ballot or whether there are 20 candidates on the ballot. I have a sample of a ballot that was used in 2013 in Minneapolis in their mayor's race, where you have a possibility of 40,495 possible combinations of candidates. And understand, we have citizens in Georgia that are complaining because they're having problems with touchscreens. They're having problems with ballot scanners. They're having problems with QR codes. And many of them on both sides of the aisle are concerned about waiting in line in our precincts. If you want someone to wait in line all day, whether it be you and your healthy self or your 80-year-old grandmother, then hand her a ballot with all of these choices and all these decisions that needed to be made and all of these bubbles on it, and ask her to stand in there and rate her first, second, third, fourth, and fifth candidates, when in actuality, she may only want to vote for one person. And so if her one person does not get the majority of the vote on one of the first or second ballots, then her vote is gone away. It's thrown. It's the ballot is discarded, and we move on to the votes of the other individuals. But what this legislation does is it prevents ranked choice voting in Georgia, except for those who already have the opportunity to do it, and that are our men and women who serve in the military. And rightly so, they should have a right that is unique to them, so they could vote, because with runoffs and other types of contests, they're not afforded the opportunity that the rest of us have of getting in our vehicle and driving to our local precinct and voting on that day. But to be clear, some of the biggest problems with ranked choice voting as it is today are exhausted votes. In other words, votes just don't count. They're exhausted. It means that your vote either overvoted or undervoted, which means you inadvertently voted twice on the same column. Or you undervoted, which means you skipped over one of those columns to vote because you were confused whether the columns were horizontal or lateral. Or you chose only a candidate who hadn't advanced any further rounds, therefore your ballot's exhausted. There was a ranked choice voting election, and I know it's going to shock everybody, but ranked choice voting is done in San Francisco. It went for 20 rounds and exhausted over 10,000 votes. And I can tell you, Senator Williams, who has the most experience as an election supervisor than anybody in the General Assembly that I'm aware of could tell you that if he had to tell the voters waiting to see the results of election that there had to be 20 rounds of counting votes to determine who won, there would be chaos in his community. This was in San Francisco. Ranked choice voting, and this, if you are confused, don't feel left out. It's a very confusing process. This confusion has led to a voter turnout that is lower than what is normally looked at throughout the United States. And I believe that is one of the things we tried to address in SB 202, was to increase the number of individuals who had the right to vote. And I believe everybody from the governor to the Secretary of State, everybody in the House and the Senate have realized that the corrections that we made, the steps forward that we took in SB 202 increased voter turnout to record numbers. And I think if we bring something like ranked choice voting into the state of Georgia, we will reverse that trend. Ranked choice voting has a tendency to recruit and draft individuals who want to disrupt the process through process delays by coming up with concerted plans as to where they want to cast their one vote for the candidate that they really want, and then how they manipulate the other votes after that in order to eliminate the biggest threat candidate in the race. One of the biggest targets for ranked choice voting is third-party candidates. All of us have to go out and run for election. I happen to go out and run for election as a Republican. And I've had opponents who ran as Democrats. And if an independent wanted to come out and run, they have that right. If they follow Georgia law, they have the right to be on the ballot with me just as much as the Democrat does. And it is my job as a candidate to go out and try to get every vote I can, not just from my Republican friends, but from my Democratic friends, my independent friends. I do not need a game system set up to eliminate an independent who may be just as qualified to serve in the Georgia State Senate as I am. And ranked choice voting sets that up. I look forward to the testimony from the experts today. And I think once you hear the testimony, you will realize that ranked choice voting, while being very novel and being very unique, would be chaos to elections in the state of Georgia. And with that, Mr. Chair, I'll yield to any questions from the committee.
Questions from the committee for the author? You must have, I started to say, I thought you'd done a great job because there were no,
I can guess where it's coming
it
from.
may, from the gentleman from
Baby.
Savannah. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Savannah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To my colleague, the senator from the 29th, I think I pretty much got that district down pat. Is it not true that the ranked choice voting will eliminate the extremism we get from the dedicated primaries?
No, sir. Actually, it increases it. It increases the extremism as the last issue I was discussing, where it gives certain groups on both sides opportunities to come in and manipulate, especially those elections with multiple candidates. As far as there are certain issues, if you review a lot of what the proponents of ranked choice voting say, you know, they're trying to look at making our elections less polarizing, less unfriendly. Well, I think you and I know that if you want to find Republicans and Democrats that treat each other with the utmost respect, it's the men and women inside this building. And we tend to do that. And a vast majority of the polarization that happens here in the state of Georgia is what we read about in the news and on television, because the vast majority of the citizens out there are too busy to try to polarize it. While I agree there is polarization in certain pockets, ranked choice voting does nothing to eliminate the polarizing. And my contention is it does more to aggravate it. To my good friend from the second best city in the state of Georgia.
Mr. Chairman, one follow-up question.
Yes, sir.
Senator, you are aware that Savannah is the first city in Georgia and therefore the best city because we are the first city. Just wanna make
Yes,
sure.
sir. You always want to be the second one so you can correct the mistakes that the first one made.
Thank you for that clarification. I appreciate it. Other questions for the author? Seeing none, we will go to first to some invited testimony from individuals from with interest in this issue, and then we'll take public input. Chair would like to recognize via Zoom Madeline Melissa. Is that right?
That's right, Mr.
Can we
Chair.
get? Thank you, Ms. Melissa. Let's see if we can't get you on the screen. If you would, just identify, thank you. Identify yourself again and tell us where you're from. I think it's Maine.
It sure is. Thank you, Chairman Burns and Vice Chairman Williams and honorable members of the committee. My name is Madeline. I am a visiting fellow at the Opportunity Solutions Project. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. We work all over the country with one clear goal, which is to help more people achieve the American dream. And I'd just like to thank the committee for the opportunity to testify via Zoom today. I am due with a baby on February 8th, so unfortunately not able to be there in person, but I appreciate the opportunity to testify here via Zoom. And I would like to thank the sponsor, Senator Robinson, Lieutenant Governor Jones, and Chairman Burns for all making this this bill a priority this session. And I'll say Georgia is a national leader on election integrity. And as the sponsor mentioned, since 2016, the General Assembly has heard voters' concern and taken action. The reforms that you've passed have increased election security and transparency and accountability. And as a result, as you know well, Georgia experienced record registration and turnout in the 2022 midterms. And I think that's a testament to the hard work of the lawmakers in your state. And I'll tell you, states across the country are looking to your example. And I would submit that banning ranked choice voting is the next step in protecting Georgia voters. And as the sponsor mentioned, SB 355 will protect voters by prohibiting ranked choice voting for all federal, state, and local elections, with an exemption for UOCAVA voters to comply with the timelines that are set by federal law. So first today, I'd like to give you an idea about what's going on nationally with ranked choice voting. In 2023, there were a record 74 bills sponsored by a variety of proponents in favor of ranked choice voting. But lawmakers across the country have wisely rejected this. And since 2022, Florida, Tennessee, Idaho, Montana, and South Dakota have all banned it statewide and preempted local jurisdictions from adopting it. And I'll tell you, just in the last few months, Louisiana and Missouri, South Carolina, Ohio, Oklahoma, Utah, and Wisconsin have all introduced bills similar to the legislation here today. In fact, no legislature has actually ever enacted ranked choice voting statewide. Maine and Alaska are the only two states to use the system in addition to local jurisdictions. And it was because they were passed by ballot initiatives, slim majorities. So let me tell you why I'm here before your committee today. I'm a lawyer and a policy expert, but I'm also a voter, and I live in Portland, Maine. So I've been voting in ranked choice voting elections since 2018, both at the local level and at the state level. And I can tell you from personal experience that ranked choice voting has been a disaster. It has been a disaster for voters in my state. It has been a disaster for candidates running for public office. And it has also been a disaster for election officials. And I'd like to tell you a few of those reasons. So first, as the sponsor mentioned, ranked choice voting requires legitimate ballots actually to be thrown out. And I think we can all agree that Americans win when their votes count. But in every election that uses ranked choice voting, ballots are thrown out. This is a design of the system. It's a feature, it's not a bug. So as the senator said, so how does this happen, right? So unlike a traditional runoff election, under a ranked choice voting system, voters have to vote for all of the candidates. He described it as a lottery ticket, and I would say it's like a CVS receipt. If you look at the ballot, it's long and it's cumbersome. And voters are required to vote for every single candidate down the ballot in order to have their votes count. And that is in order for the system to manufacture that 50+1 majority. So if a voter decides that they only want to vote for one candidate, as they do right now in Georgia, either as their first choice or for all the choices, and that candidate's no longer in contention, the ballot is thrown out. So let me tell you how that's worked on the track record in the real world here. So in Maine, in 2018, our 2nd congressional district, it's our northern district, our rural district, there were over 8,000 ballots that were thrown out. These are people who showed up on election day, cast their ballots only to have them discarded They walked away not knowing whether or not their ballots counted. Those voters could have just stayed home. In Alaska, who has also experienced similar results in their 2022 special election, this was the one to fill the seat of the late Congressman Don Young. There were nearly 15,000 ballots thrown out. And in New York City's 2021, it was the Democratic mayoral primary. 140,000 ballots were thrown out. That was nearly 15% of the total ballots cast. I think we can all agree that that is a huge problem for voters. So the second big issue is the delayed results from ranked choice voting, which of course, as we know, causes mistrust from the voters. Ranked choice voting guarantees multiple rounds of ballot counting because of the complicated nature of the ballots and the tabulation. So if no candidate receives a majority, this process has to go on. And as the sponsor mentioned, sometimes 20 rounds, like in that San Francisco race. It delays results, sometimes for weeks, months. And I'll give you an example. This is in 2022 out of Alameda County, California. You may have heard about this race. It was a glitch in the ranked choice voting software at 2 months after the election was certified. So the third place winner had actually, the third place finisher had actually won that election. And then in the 2021 New York City Democratic mayoral primary that I mentioned, that was thrown into absolute chaos because a week after counting, there were 11 rounds of tabulation. They discovered an error as well. 135,000 test ballots had been counted by mistake. So it took 8 additional rounds of counting and a month to declare the winner, even though Eric Adams had actually won in the first round of that race. And here in Maine, I'll tell you, we had 8 days to decide the official winner of our 2022 congressional race up in the 2nd district because of a technical snafu. It led to 2 memory sticks, which had recorded more than 16,000 ballots. They were corrupted. So ballots are discarded, results are delayed. And I will tell you, it is an incredibly complicated voting process. And I urge you to take a look, as the senator said, that Minneapolis race, the ballots, incredibly confusing. So if you've never seen it, take a look. And I'll say also, voters are given an ultimatum, right? So that's a really important point I want you to consider for the voters in your district. Either vote for people you dislike, who might oppose your principles, or risk having your ballot tossed aside. That is the choice of ranked choice voting. So, and to those of you who hold elective office, unless you want your ballot to be tossed, you would actually have to vote for your opponent in your race under ranked choice voting. Again, consider the voters in your district, vulnerable voters like the elderly, right? That's what happens here in Maine. I'm telling you, race after race. They've been voting one way, and now all of a sudden they are forced to vote for all of those candidates all the way down the ticket in order to guarantee that their ballots will count. Another really important point I want to reiterate here before the committee is that under ranked choice voting, winners lose and losers win. That's a routine issue with ranked choice voting. So in that congressional race here in Maine that I was mentioning, the incumbent actually received the most first place votes, beating his opponent by almost 1%. He would have been the winner under a traditional election, but because of the challenger was declared the election because of ranked choice voting. And that challenger never actually received a majority of the ballots cast in the election, only a majority of the ballots that were not tossed aside. And I want to give you one more local example. Where I live in Portland, Maine, we had a race in 2021. There was a candidate who had a mere 4% of the vote after the first round of tabulation, but he won and was given a seat locally on our government because of ranked choice voting. So I urge you, just think about your most recent election or your colleagues. Does that kind of result sound fair? And I can tell you as a voter, results like these do not inspire confidence. One other point I'd like to make is just that instant runoff voting is a real misnomer. I've heard a lot of people just say this is an instant version of a general runoff. Well, it's not. Ranked choice voting is not an instant runoff vote because of all of the delays that are required under the system. And it's not a viable alternative because ballots are thrown out. It does not produce a majority. It is an instant, and it turns winners into losers. I think we can all agree that elections should be fair and prompt and inspire voter confidence, and every vote should count. Any voting that, by design, throws out valid votes should be banned. It's un-American, undemocratic, and I urge you to protect the voters in your state by rejecting this disastrous voting system, the nightmare that we've lived here in Maine, and supporting SB 355. I appreciate your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you for your input. I look to the committee. Are there questions for the invited witness? Any questions? Seeing no questions. Thank you for your input. We appreciate it. I need a temperature alert. What's the temperature where you are in Portland, Maine today?
Well, I'm going to tell you, we had 14 inches of snow last week, so it's chilly here.
Okay, I want to make one comment. I've never shoveled humidity. So to the south, you can put your snow shovel away, okay?
Duly noted. Thank you,
Thank
Mr.
you.
Chair.
Thank you for your input. Thank you. It's all right. It's other stuff. All right. Our second person is Jordan Kittleson. Jordan, are you here? If you will join us, please. If you could limit your comments to around 5 minutes, and then we'll take questions as appropriate. State your name and your professional affiliation.
Chairman Burns and distinguished members of the committee. My name is Jordan Kittleson. I'm the policy director for the America First Policy Institute, and I came in today from the other bastion of election integrity, the beautiful state of Arizona. I appear before you today in support of Senate Bill 355 to prohibit ranked choice voting for any local, state, or federal elected office. RCV is a confusing, chaotic, disenfranchising system whereby the person with the most votes doesn't always win, which is essentially un-American to its core. The process makes the fundamental right of voting harder for both voters and election workers alike, as the voter is easily prone to make mistakes during what is an unnecessarily prolonged period of multiple voting rounds of ranking candidate preferences, after which, if not submitted correctly, the person's vote ultimately isn't counted anyway because their preferred candidate has been eliminated from contention due to ballot exhaustion. Our system is built upon the fairness and transparency of one person having their one vote counted one time, not one in which some people's votes are worth more than others. And I think every senator sitting in this committee would agree with that notion. Members of this committee also agree that election workers are already under a significant amount of pressure. Imagine a scenario in which these same people are compelled to preside over a system where instead of counting totals for two candidates for office, the election workers and their equipment rank the order of ballots for multiple candidates for an office, then redistribute and re-rank those votes multiple times after the first count until eventually one candidate reaches 50+1. Truth be told, most Democrats and Republicans I know in this state and around the country agree that this could even make a voting machine cry. What this simply translates to is more pressure, more counting errors, and a more time-consuming environment when more Georgians than ever are demanding and deserve timely and accurate election results. And to make matters worse, a recent MIT study showed that RCV in Maine increased rather than reduced outside spending on the toxic negative political advertisements that millions of Americans have come to resent. And in a recent school board election in Oakland, California, where ranked choice voting was used, a major error led to local officials even swearing in the wrong winner. It took 3.5 months before the rightful winner was sworn in. Is this the type of complexity and twisted process that we wish to subject hundreds of thousands of voters in Georgia to? In fact, in Alaska, since ballot measure 2 was passed in 2020, implementing California-style jungle primaries and ranked choice voting, Alaskans have collected just in the past several months over twice the required number of signatures needed to send to the legislature a full repeal of ranked choice voting. With full consideration of this testimony today, I urge the members of this committee to move this bill forward, and I applaud Chairman Burns, Senator Robertson, Lieutenant Governor Jones, and members of this committee for raising awareness to this issue, and yield the remainder of my time back to the chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your input. You do have a question. Senator from the second.
Now, I haven't studied ranked choice voting, and I haven't read a litany of information, but just follow me with my public school education. If myself, the senator from the second, and the senator from the 29th were on the ballot, now we don't agree on everything half the time, but if we're on the ballot and then we were with the good senator from Augusta and the 22nd, and we were all three on the ballot, and the senator from the 29th beat us both out because he got over 50 and won. It ain't no rescoring. He's ahead plus the 50 and 1. So there's no need for any rescoring. Is that not true?
So ranked choice voting has oftentimes been termed the Common Core of elections. And so the Common Core of elections doesn't begin until one candidate does not reach 50+1. If there is a candidate that reaches 50+1 in the first round, then they are declared the winner. It's only if they don't reach 50+1 where it goes through multiple rounds of tabulation. However, that scenario is not likely because in ranked choice voting, oftentimes final five voting is utilized for the purposes of the primary election, and those top five candidates from the primary make their way into the general. So it is very difficult for a candidate to achieve 50+1 when you have several candidates running on the same ballot in the general.
Just one other follow-up question, Mr. Chairman. So when we talk about the ranked choice voting, like for example, I follow the states as you've mentioned, you came from Arizona. So for example, in Alaska, there's a Democratic congresswoman who loves guns, fish, and has won because of ranked choice voting because she is a Democrat, but she loves guns and fish, and she's an Alaskan. So she's prevailed because for folks who love guns, fish, and Alaska, she's the candidate of their choice. So I'm just trying to understand how that diminishes a voter's capacity because it allows them the opportunity to pick somebody that likes their ideals. Because I might like guns, and I know the senator from 29th likes guns, but the senator from 22nd may not. So we might get kicked out of the race, and the senator from 22nd is still in because he doesn't like guns. But that's just my understanding of it. Maybe you can shed light on that a little bit better for me.
Well, I because of the capacity that I appear in, I can't go into the philosophical, ideological component of ranked choice voting. But I will tell you, in that Alaska election, in the initial round of voting, there were far more votes for the other two candidates initially than there were for the ultimate winner in that election. So the will of the voters were ultimately ignored because the election went through multiple rounds of tabulation. And in Alaska, as you well know, how could you rightfully have an at-large congressional election whereby somebody of that persuasion won or advanced through the election, but then you have a state in the presidential contest that went so far in the other direction? It seems like there is an attempt, an effort to disenfranchise voters and instead insert other winners who really ultimately were losers initially in the first round. And that is the most disenfranchising thing, because oftentimes when the ultimate when the person who has won the election has been declared the winner, by that time there have been thousands and thousands of ballots that have been tossed and people as a result that have been disenfranchised. And so any election, any system of voting whereby you have some ballots that have been counted and other ballots that have been subject to what's called ballot exhaustion or tossed or thrown out. That goes against the very foundational concepts of freedom, fairness, and transparency that our founding fathers originally meant for this country. And that's how I respond to that question.
I just want to clarify that you can have a state that goes in totally different direction. The state of Kentucky has a Democratic governor, 2 Republican U.S. senators, and overwhelmingly went for former President Trump. So I don't believe that that's true at all.
Thank you for your question. Other questions from the committee? Chair sees none. Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate your input. We've now, I'm sorry, we have a question?
Oh, you said we like fish and go?
Oh, you like fish and go? That's right. That's right, especially in Alaska. Thank you. I appreciate your input. We've heard from 2 individuals that are supportive of the bill. We're now going to hear from 3 individuals that oppose the bill. And I'd like to invite Scott Turner, former state representative Scott Turner, to come join us and share with us your input.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I had actually prepared a couple of notes, but I want to answer a couple of questions that kind of came up just now. And Senator Milo's question over, and I hate talking about Alaska because nobody in Georgia is pitching you the Alaska model. So we can discount that altogether. But a unique thing did happen in Alaska, and over a third of Nick Begich, who was the other Republican besides Sarah Palin in that race, over a third of Sarah Palin or Nick Begich's voters voted for the Democrat in that race. That was a will of the people's election result. So to your point, there was a great deal of crossover, and that's based upon candidate quality first and foremost. And I believe elections are won not by systems, but by candidate quality first and foremost. But in 2013, I was elected in a special election. There were 5 of us in that first round. I think one of them dropped out, got disqualified. So there was 4 of us heading into election day on January 5th, 2013. And I was 122 votes shy of winning without runoff in a 4-way race. And I had this whole big agenda in my head, and I had to sit and wait for a month while I went and run a special election runoff. And that runoff happened on February 5th, 2013. And the vote total for total turnout was 1,500 votes, which was about what I got in the first round when there were 4 people in the vote. And I wanted to talk about ethics reform, and I wanted to talk about civil asset forfeiture reform, and I wanted to talk about liberty and justice for all. And the very first conversation I ever had with Speaker David Ralston, he asked me, "What do you want to work on?" I said, "I want to get rid of runoffs." And he said, "You might find some allies in this building." It took me a while. State Representative Wes Cantrell came along later and convinced me that ranked choice voting was the solution to our runoff problem. And runoffs are a problem in Georgia. I live here, by the way. I'm not an outside group. I represented 21st House District for 8 years honorably. I'm here to advocate for my neighbors, not from some far off place, but Kennesaw State University recently published a study where they said $75 million out of local coffers have to be used for any statewide runoff. $75 million. Think about that for a second. That's potholes that can't be filled. That's a playground that can't be built. That's a police officer's salary that goes unpaid. $75 million. That's a problem. The second problem is these folks who are talking about on the screen and they come up here and they talk about trash ballots or ballots that are thrown out. In some of our latest runoffs that we've had for the U.S. Senate, 500,000 people don't come back. Their first round vote, thrown out like it never counted. Their voice is silenced by our current runoff system. It's not right. It's been as high as many as 750,000 people haven't come back to vote in the second round. Now, there are some people who aren't going to vote for a second choice on a ballot, but I would posit to you, if you give them the opportunity, be far less than what we see in our current system today. The second thing is, or the third thing that this Kennesaw State talked about was the actual political climate of runoffs and how much more negative through the holidays we have to be bombarded with negative advertisements. And you can get that. I've sent it to all of you last year and years previous. It's not a new study. It's been out for a couple of years now. SB 202 introduced RCV to Georgia. meaning that if you voted for SB 202, you actually voted to bring ranked choice voting to Georgia for the first time. It's the only way it's ever been used in Georgia for military and overseas voters. It allowed, for a very specific reason, it allowed us to go from a 2-month runoff where we were certifying our final winners in January to a 1-month runoff where we are certifying now at the end of November, early December. SB 355 carves out an exception for these folks. So you're not actually banning anything. And it's important to know that UOCAVA is the only thing that we use ranked choice voting for. So you are actually passing a piece of legislation that doesn't ban anything new. And in fact, creates an exception that preserves ranked choice voting for Georgia. So you're not actually doing the thing that you're set out to do in banning ranked choice voting. And here's the thing, if it's so bad, if ranked choice voting is so bad, why are you subjecting our men and women in uniform to something that is confusing and would disenfranchise them? It doesn't make sense. Your work on SB 202 and allowing for ranked choice voting met a very specific need. You saw value in it. You would never ban it because it's working for this specific instance. We have no stories of a soldier or Marine or airman being confused by their ranked choice ballot. At least not that I know of. I mean, maybe they're out there. If ranked choice voting, I want to talk about a little bit about timing too. City of Boulder, Colorado just ran a ranked choice ballot. They have multiple rounds. You know, I've heard some folks come up here and tell you it takes forever for the results to be tallied. City of Boulder, Colorado had multiple rounds. They ran their instant runoffs within a couple of days. They declared a winner within a few days, had certified results by the end of the week of the election. Compare that to how we do it today. At a minimum, we don't know who our winner is for a month. And we have to pay for it, $75 million. And we have 500,000 people who are silenced by that process. You know, there's a study by Tad Kauser. He's a political science professor. He says, for every one piece of misinformation, you have to overcome that with 4 pieces of refutation. And unfortunately, that's where we find ourselves in the RCV debate today. We recently had a panel discussion. I invited you all, and I would hope that you'll have an opportunity to watch the video where we debunked many of the myths about ranked choice voting. The panel featured at least one of the folks you'll hear from today who has actually run ranked choice voting elections. And we collected emails from legislators, from you guys, that sent us the stuff that you are hearing from people who are opposed to ranked choice voting. And what we found is the opposition really fits into 2 categories. The first category is demonstrably false. It's just untrue. Second category is technically true, but runoffs are worse. And I'll give you a couple examples. One opponent, in the post-election polls, wherever ranked choice voting is used, whether it's in Maine, Utah, Republican Party of Virginia, wherever it's used, 80 to 90% of the people say it was simple and easy and it wasn't confusing whatsoever. That's across the board. It doesn't matter where. It could be a blue state, red state, doesn't matter. Happened in New York, even with all the stuff that has allegedly been confusing about New York. It's just not confusing. The only thing confusing about ranked choice voting is the opposition. Ranked choice voting is as easy as 1, 2, 3. Think about your 3 favorite ice cream colors. Which one do you want first? There's your first choice. You go to Baskin Robbins. I'm sure you can come up with 40,000 different combinations of Baskin Robbins. You have no problem picking out who your first choice is. The second thing is I've heard opposition to ranked choice voting talk about one specific race out in Burlington, Vermont. And they talk about how the first round, a candidate got 29% of the vote, and then that person became the winner. And they say any system where somebody can only get 29% in the first round and become the winner is not legitimate. And let me introduce you to 2 individuals. The first is Lieutenant Governor Jeff Duncan. Got 26.7% of the vote in his first round. He became Lieutenant Governor of the state. Second person I want to introduce to is Brian Kemp. Brian Kemp got 25.5% in his first round. Last time I checked, it's less than 29%. Became governor of the state and has led us through some tumultuous times with an ease I envy. What a great leader Brian Kemp is. That's not a knock on ranked choice voting or instant runoffs. That's a knock on any type of runoff. Those types of results happen today. It's not a knock on ranked choice voting. I have a lot of other stuff written down. I'm really passionate about this issue because I want to see elections in Georgia maximize. As a conservative, I want to see elections run as efficiently as possible. I want to see people's voices have maximum opportunity to be heard. And I want to see elections run without 2 months extra runoff. And I think the people of Georgia want that too. And they at least would like an opportunity to have to use this in very key specific ways so they can continue to do a proof of concept on it, just like what you authorized in SB 202. Thank you.
Thank you for your input. Senator from Columbus, 29.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Scott, it's good to see you today.
Thank you, Mr. Whip.
You brought up the Uniformed and Overseas Citizen Absentee Voting Act and said that we voted on that and we passed that in SB 202. Is that the way I understood that?
Yeah, that's correct.
Is that federal law?
No, the UOCAVA is federal law, but you
Yeah.
allow for ranked choice voting in SB 202.
Yeah. And we allow it for military individuals overseas?
You allow for ranked choice voting to be used for UOCAVA voters in SB 202.
Okay, so you answered my question without answering my question. I appreciate that.
If I don't understand your question,
I appreciate that. Let me ask you a question. If I go into Baskin Robbins, should I be mandated to get 3 flavors of ice cream or can I just get chocolate?
well, here's the thing. What if chocolate's not available?
My question is, if chocolate is available and I walk into Baskin Robbins, should I
And
be
you want-
mandated to get 3 different flavors or
No.
can I just get chocolate?
No, and that's not how ranked choice voting works. If you wanted chocolate, you could just walk in and get chocolate.
I'm using your example. That's all it is. And I appreciate your time. Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you, sir.
Other questions? Have spirited discussion. Other questions? Representative Turner, you've exhausted us. I'm sorry.
I have that effect on folks.
Highly
It's not
unlikely.
balanced, sir.
Highly unlikely. Thank you for your input. Our next testimony comes from Josh Daniels. Mr. Daniels, if you would please introduce yourself and share with the committee your input.
Thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. My name is Josh Daniels. I am a former election official. I feel a little bit like a combat veteran because I counted votes in the 2020 election. It was an eventful year. But in that election, I was serving as the county clerk and county auditor in the second largest county in the state of Utah, Utah County. It's a creative name. About 700,000 folks that live in that county. And our county was the first county to implement ranked choice voting for municipalities in our state. And I was privileged to administer those types of elections for our municipalities in our area. But, you know, I'm not new to ranked choice voting. Our Republican Party in Utah has actually been using ranked choice voting for over 20 years in some of our party meetings, our caucuses, and our party conventions. It really speeds the meeting up when you've got 4 or 5 candidates running for one spot. Instead of having multiple rounds of voting and keeping all of the party leadership in the same room for hours and hours, we've begun allowing a ranked ballot that we would submit, and we've been doing that for a couple of decades now. And so when we implemented ranked choice voting in our county, we didn't experience any of these problems that people are talking about. I've heard, you know, things are disastrous. That's not what I've heard. I've met the Secretary of State from the state of Maine, and they said that it was easy and that they didn't have a lot of problems. I've met other election officials around the country and have not heard sort of any of these actual sort of war stories, if you will. I mean, I could share war stories because I served in Fallujah, Iraq with the Marines. And about 16 years ago, I was watching that, you know, war of 5 Republican candidates in the New Hampshire primary about this time, 16 years ago. And I was sitting in the chow hall in Fallujah, Iraq. And sometimes at that same chow hall, I'd sit at the same table as this Navy lawyer named Ron DeSantis. Little did I know he was going to get in that war up on that television 16 years later. But I remember thinking back then, boy, 5 candidates for president and you only get to pick one. And this kind of underscores the reason why folks want to use ranked choice voting. In our cities, the cities wanted to use it because they had to have a runoff as well. They would have to have an election in August and then an election in November. And in August, they would narrow the number of candidates running for council and mayor down to a certain number that would go on to the sort of general election. They're nonpartisan races, so the general election functioned as a runoff. And one of the things that they noticed was that in the summertime, people really were not keen on voting for people for city council in the middle of the summer. There was a lot less people interested in that election, a lot less turnout. And so some cities wanted to use ranked choice voting to say, well, let's just vote on all the candidates in November when people are familiar with election time, and we'll devote a little more attention to the candidates. And we don't have to pay all the money to have this preliminary election, if you will, in the summertime. And so we used these ranked ballots so that folks could just vote in November and not worry about this splitting or spoiling effect that necessitates the runoff that you all are very familiar with in some of your notable U.S. Senate races. So as we implemented ranked choice voting, we were very concerned about whether it would be easy for voters or not. And we did some sampling, we did some education, we did some polling. We went to an assisted living center and had residents there use the ballot. We didn't give them any explanation. We just gave them the ranked ballots and saw if they could figure it out or not, and saw what kinds of concerns came up. Here to report to you that there weren't any concerns. It was pretty intuitive for them to rank and bubble, you know, first, second, third choice. When it came to counting the votes, it was not any more difficult than any of the other ballots. We use the same systems. We scan the same paper ballots. We go through the same reporting cycle. There's just one more step at the end where within your system, you just run the sort of winner selection process to do that instant runoff that ranked choice voting requires. And we were able to report ranked choice election results at the same time we reported plurality election results from other cities and other elections. And so we didn't experience any of these disastrous or difficult hurdles that have been discussed. And then we were able to audit the election the same way we do all of our other elections. We even did some post-election surveys to see about voter satisfaction. Voters reported overwhelmingly that they found the ballot easy, that they did not find it confusing, that they liked the ranked choice, and that they wanted to continue doing ranked choice. And we've now done ranked choice elections for our municipalities for 3 different election cycles. And the post-election survey results are always the same. A commanding majority of respondents who have participated in ranked choice elections find it easy to use, don't find it confusing, want to continue to use it, they like it. And so we've had a good experience with that. This certainly has become more of a political issue recently. I think the main example is why it's political, because what you probably didn't hear was that second congressional district in Maine, what had happened in Maine was that was a blue district. It went for Bill Clinton. It went for Obama. It is a solid blue district. But in Maine, they have 3 very viable parties: the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, and the Progressive Party. And what had happened was a very popular statewide Republican official who wasn't particularly extreme. He was able to win as a Republican in that blue district because the Democrats and the progressives, that voting coalition, if you will, kind of split themselves. And so a Republican won a blue district, which if you're team Republican, that's pretty cool. When your opposition splits themselves, so to speak. But then what happened was Maine instituted ranked choice voting. And so then that Republican lost after being in office for a couple of cycles. And so if you're a Republican and you're in that district in Maine, well, then, yeah, you don't like this. But at the same time, this cuts both ways, right? At the end of the day, I think the thing that matters most is getting a majority of your community to sort of make their choice known at the time that it makes sense to make that choice. In the case of Utah cities, it makes more sense to vote in November than to vote in June. And I think for your state, you can understand that getting your voters in November to be the commanding decision on who wins a U.S. Senate race and not telling the citizens they need to show back up a month later to sort things out, that's going to be more effective. You're going to have broader participation and more buy-in from your electorate based as to who won those elections. And I think that's the power of ranked choice elections is it eliminates the need to have runoffs or multiple cycles of elections. It eliminates vote splitting and spoiled elections, and voters then leave more satisfied, and you actually have outcomes that are more broadly representative, because often you're having those ranked elections at the time when most people are going to be participating. So for those reasons, I think you should consider it. And if you have questions about implementation, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you for your input. The chair recognizes the senator from the 50th.
Mic number 16. Thank you. First, thank you for your service. And thank you for coming to testify today. I had a question about the military ranked choice ballots. Is it not true that the ballots that we send are, we technically send two ballots, one which is a regular ballot that they vote on, and then a separate ballot that is a ranked ballot, just in case there is a runoff?
So your specific way that you do it in Georgia, I can't speak to that, but I've heard that, but it wouldn't need to be two ballots. But I mean, it really depends on how your local clerks are actually counting and organizing. Some states will do just one ranked ballot for those overseas citizens, but you could do what you just described as well.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. The chair recognizes the senator from the 2nd.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a question so I like to keep this, so my constituents back down I-16 are watching this. When you talk about the ranked choice voting, if you wanted to vote for one person, you could vote for one person and let that be it, right?
Absolutely.
If that's what your wish was.
That's right.
I'm gonna vote for this one person. If he don't make it happen, then God be with him, right? That's how ranked choice voting would kind of work.
Absolutely.
So you don't have to vote for everybody. You can
That's
just
right.
pick your person and go,
Exactly.
and you're done.
That's right.
But if there's no runoff, so there's no situation where you would be able to come back and vote for the next person, right?
Exactly. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
And final question for you is, if you are going to have runoffs, then would you believe that the state should then invest in making sure voters know that there is a runoff so that they can come back out?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's one of those things that's very difficult. You have a runoff and voters may not know, hey, you got to show back up in November or December, January, right? And I think when you get to that question about you can just vote for one, you can just pick chocolate. The problem with the election is that if you just pick chocolate, you have to wait until you put your order in to find out they're out of stock. And oh, by the way, you don't get anything. Imagine going to a restaurant and they give you a menu, and on the menu is a ribeye, a fillet, and halibut. And then you say, well, are all these fish in stock? Well, so we don't know until you put your order in. Okay, well, I order the fillet. Okay, what do you order? The ribeye, you order the halibut. Great. Then the server comes back, says, hey, sorry, we're out of the ribeye. Well, can I have the fillet? Nope. There's only one chance to make your order. You made your order. Now we're out of stock. That's what happens in the election, right? You come to the Senate election, you say, I vote for the Libertarian. It's like, well, the race is not between the Libertarian. It's between the Republican and the Democrat. So you need to make a choice. Oh, you don't get an opportunity to make that choice. You got to come back in a month and make that choice, right? So you don't get to find out really what that race is about until it's too late. You've already thrown your vote away in a sense. You've been given a really poor choice. And I think ranked choice is a better choice. It gives you the option to give all of your choices.
Thank you. Chair recognizes the senator from the 29th.
Thanks, sir. I appreciate you making the trip from Utah, right?
Yes, sir.
So when you were the clerk at audit, right?
Correct.
Would that be similar to the election superintendent maybe here in Georgia?
Correct.
Okay. Now, were you there when the pilot project started?
Yes.
Okay. And how long did it go as a pilot project before it became the actual method of done?
So under current state law, it's still a pilot. Cities can choose to use that method if they want. And every year a city's having an election, they can choose that year to use it or to not use it. And so the first year that was offered was 19. We have an odd year for municipalities. And then cities have done it again in 21 and then more recently in 23.
Cities that have not used it, then used it, or used it, and then not used it?
Yeah, cities have switched back and forth. A lot of the reason that they might use it or not use it is depending on how many candidates are going to be running for office. If a lot of candidates run, it necessitates that June, what they call a primary election.
Who makes the decision if you use it or not use it?
The city councils make a decision to opt in or to use it or to not.
Are city council members in your, are they elected?
Yep, city council are elected, nonpartisan, so it's not a party affiliation, but they're all
Right.
elected.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions for the witness? Thank you for coming. Thank you for sharing. We're grateful. We have one more invited presenter or witness, Wes Cantrell, Representative Wes Cantrell. We're grateful for his presence.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a bucket list item of mine to come back after 8 years serving down here and speak against my friend's bills.
We're
This is a-
excited to have you.
This is a
Mr.
challenging issue. There's good people on both sides of this, okay? So, one of my best friends opposes me on this issue. I get it. So I'm just here to very briefly make my case for this. But I understand how things work around here and there are political forces at play. So I'm gonna try to persuade you based upon experience and facts, all right? So 2014, I got elected. I got to experience firsthand a 9-week runoff in the middle of the summer, begging people to come back and vote. Please come back and vote. I got a clear majority in the primary, but I had to come back because I didn't get 50% plus one. I knew if I made the runoff, I would win because the other two candidates, I knew I was the second choice of both of them. So I won, but I almost had 70% of the vote, but there was a 21% drop off in the summer to vote. This really alerted me personally to the problems we have with runoffs. In fact, that year it would have been a much larger runoff, but much larger drop off. But we had a senatorial race and we had a congressional race in my district that drove some of that turnoff. It would have been a lot worse. Runoffs result in voter fatigue, much less turnout. On average, it's over 30% less people turn out for the runoff. Millions of taxpayers' dollars are wasted on something that could be easily avoided. The only people who like runoffs are political campaign consultants because they make a lot of money off of all of us during those times. That's the only people that like them. Voters hate them. They hate runoffs. And I'm here for the voter, okay? So I immediately began to study. I called it instant runoff voting back then, or RCV. It's the same thing. Right after I got elected, I began to try to persuade my colleagues that this was a good idea. Nobody had heard of it. But let's be clear. Ranked choice voting does not eliminate runoffs. It simply makes the runoff, if necessary, occur on the same night as the regular election. You still got a runoff. It just happens on the same night. You don't have to wait what used to be 9 weeks, now it's 4 weeks. So I began to run these ideas by leadership. I finally got their permission to run with some bills so I would get a fair hearing on these bills. This all happened prior to the election of 2020. Let's be clear. Prior to the election of 2020, I wrote 3 bills. One was the bill that's been talked about. It became part of SB 202, HB 59, which allowed for ranked choice voting for overseas citizens and military personnel. HB 284, which allowed municipalities or counties, if they so chose in their area, local control, if they wanted to use RCV, they could do so. And HB 285, which would allow for ranked choice voting in presidential general elections only, since we don't have a runoff for our presidential election. Let's just pretend for a moment we had RCV in that 2020 fun election we had. The winner of our presidential election got 49.5% of the vote. The loser got 49.3% of the vote. 65,000 people voted for a third-party candidate. The research shows that had those people had the opportunity to vote for their second choice, the election would have been different. We'd had a different outcome. Senate race that year, one candidate received 49.7% of the vote, higher than the presidential person who won all 100% of our electoral votes. And yet he was subjected to a runoff in which he lost because there was a lot of reasons. We'll leave it at that. But 10% less people showed up for the runoff. RCV is not a partisan issue. It doesn't benefit Democrats or Republicans. It benefits taxpayers and voters. That's who it benefits. So I told you, you know this already, it came up earlier, my bill got rolled into SB 202, which I assume most of the Rs at this table, all the Rs at this table today voted for. It resulted in moving to a 4-week runoff instead of the ridiculous 9-week one that we had endured for years. An instant runoff would help us avoid all of these negative things. If you had more than 2 candidates, you don't have to vote. I keep hearing, there's a lot of, I've forgotten what it's like being down here with a lot of the spin and the misinformation. Okay. But you don't have to vote for every candidate on the ballot. Plus, you guys would control what RCV would look like if you wanted to. It doesn't have to look like what Maine did or these examples that are given. Everybody, you figure out, you make it, you write the rules for how you want it to work. It doesn't have to be blanket. It could be just for general elections. It could be just for a presidential election where we don't have a runoff in Georgia. And routinely, we give 100% of our electoral votes to someone who didn't even get 50% of the vote. So we got a problem in Georgia with these runoffs. We can fix it. Instant runoff voting, RCV, results in a true majority. Runoffs give you a false majority because you have less people that come out, a whole lot less in a lot of cases. It allows voters to vote their conscience instead of being forced to choose between the lesser of 2 evils. You can vote for your first choice and then know that your second choice will count if your first choice doesn't make it to the runoff. Okay. Now let's be clear. We're facing a time where we're about to get to a general election where there's a lot of voters in America that don't like either choice. And I would submit to you that if none of the above was on the ballot, he would have a really good chance at winning this fall if it goes like it looks like we're going. We need to have more choices for voters so they can vote their conscience and not feel like they have to vote for a person because that's really the only 2 viable candidates. Money, runoffs are expensive. We talked about the negative campaigning. One of the things I did in my election, the 2 people I was running against, they were just killing each other. I didn't say a word about any of my opponents. I just ran on what I was for. And guess what? I won because they were too busy fighting. And I knew because they were fighting, if I went to a runoff, all those people were coming my way for either voting. It's exactly, I got 40% of the runoff. They both got about 30 and I got the other 30. So I got 70 in the general and then 70 in the runoff. Access, more candidates will run for office if we have ranked choice voting, and a third-party candidate can actually know how much support they really had based upon the first ballot. You know, a third-party candidate in Georgia never knows because people are, what do I do? Do I throw my vote away, quote unquote, by voting for the Libertarian or the Green Party or whatever? Or do I vote for one of the candidates I think might actually win? So RCV eliminates that problem for the voter. So that's what I got, Mr. Chairman. Happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you. Thank you for your input. We appreciate it. Again, my good friend from Savannah.
Now, I just want to make it clear, Mr. Chairman, I know everybody's thinking I'm asking all the questions, but there are only 2 Democrats, 3 in total on the committee. So I get to ask a lot of questions. All right.
We're
so we know
glad
that.
to have your input,
All right.
Senator.
You've asked a lot of questions. If my memory serves right, it didn't matter how many D's or R's were in the room.
That-
But go ahead. I'm not.
Well,
that's
you
the
know,
way I remember it.
So Representative Cantrell, this would probably be the second issue we actually would agree on, right? The first was daylight savings time.
That's right.
It's very controversial. And the second would be ranked choice voting. Now, let me be clear, this would have affected the outcome of the 2 U.S. senators that are in my party. I'm gonna be the first to admit that. It definitely would affect the outcome. But I was in a runoff, 5-person runoff. I won by 20 votes in my House race, 5 people in a race. And I did have people vote for me and leave. But if there was an opportunity to kind of look at how we do the ballots and how ranked choice voting works, what would be your assumption as to the benefit to the voter versus the state? Because what I'm trying to understand is I've heard from 2 conservative folks and I believe 2 other folks that are conservative, and there's a split on the issue. And where my folks are, I'm agnostic about ranked choice voting or the 50 and 1. And if you don't get 50 and 1, then you get pulled into a runoff. And, so how do you find the happy medium in that? What would be the ideal compromise? I know that's a bad word, I didn't cuss, but I'm Baptist. But what would be the compromise to make this a reality? So one, it's easier on voters. Two, it doesn't cost any money because, as you know, Representative, we don't appropriate any money to administer elections in the state of Georgia. So this falls back to local taxpayers. So what would be the fiscally conservative answer to that?
Well, I'm not sure I'm completely following your question, but I would say that, number one, we say down here, we believe in local control. So I think a great starting point would be to allow municipalities and counties, if they want to implement it, and then see how it goes before you prohibit it across the board, except for military and overseas citizens. I also think that you could select the elections, not make it blanket, but if you wanted to try it in a general election only where typically there's 3 candidates, because that 3-candidate model works the best with RCV. It does. It's simple. It's right to the point. But the people that are arguing hardest for it are those that are in these municipal elections where there's 20 people are running for city council, and it's so much expense. It's so hard to get voters to come out and vote. People are getting elected, with 25, 30 votes in a town that's got thousands of people. It's just not. The process is flawed. And it's because we just wear our voters out. They're just tired of it. 2020 was a great example. And we had to vote twice in the spring, twice in the fall, and then in January. People are just sick of it. If we want voter engagement, get rid of the runoffs, man. I mean, people are engaged, but when you're running campaign commercials during Thanksgiving and Christmas holidays, people are just sick of it. They're tired of it. They're not coming back, and it poisons the whole system.
Thank you for your input. I appreciate it. To the senator's point, there are 4 Democrats on this committee. Regrettably, only 2 are present this evening, but
Point made.
you're always welcome.
That's because one's an ex officio.
That is true, but quite a number of the Republicans on this committee are also ex officio.
Well, can you get me some more ex officio Democrats, Mr. Chairman?
I'm sure we'll take that under consideration, Senator. Thank you. Okay. That concludes the input from those who've had been previously scheduled. We have only 3 input individuals who requested to share their insights. We welcome you if you could. By the way, if I understand it correctly, all 3 are in favor of the legislation. So the chair will recognize Victoria Cruz. Ms. Cruz?
Right, that's correct.
We could limit your input to 3 minutes if we could as we move forward in the evening. We are now approaching 6:15.
Yes. Is this,
It is indeed.
all right. I hope you can all hear me. Yeah, my name is Victoria Cruz and I'm from Athens, Georgia. So I drove a little bit to get here, but it's not as far as Arizona or Utah. I am in favor of the bill because I believe ranked choice voting should be banned for all of the reasons that Senator Robertson brought up. I have been looking into ranked choice voting for quite a while. And I just have not seen a case where it turned out without controversy. There's an amount of opacity to the process, opacity in the voting. You don't know whether your vote was filled out correctly, especially in the case of absentee ballots. Ranked choice voting in an absentee ballot, if you make a mistake at the polls, you can redo it. They'll tell you that you made a mistake, or did you realize you should, vote for all these? But if you do it as an absentee, your ballot comes in and the way you filled it out is not known until it's opened and run through. And if it is rejected for some reason, like you overvoted or you undervoted, like you didn't like any of them, so you put them all last in the last few and left a few first spots open, then your vote would be totally thrown out at that point. So the absentee ballot and absentee balloting is very popular. It's very popular in both parties for a lot of reasons. So I really think that the legislature should, the committee should take that into account. And I also want to bring to your attention something I emailed all of you. It is the ALEC, American Legislative Exchange Council's policy. It's model policy that was passed this summer. A lot of input from a lot of election integrity organizations passed this, and it's called the Safeguard American Votes and Elections Act. And not only does it recommend that ranked choice voting be banned, but also anything that even that is masquerading. There's also instant runoff. I think that wording should be in the bill. There is also star voting and approval voting. And I'm pretty sure that certain elite mathematicians are working on new ways of getting a new form of voting that they can manipulate. And that is the biggest problem as well, when I look at ranked choice voting, is that the electorate can be manipulated.
Thank you.
Nowadays, we have text messaging.
Thank you for your input. This, if you would, please, you have some additional information you'd like to submit as written testimony. Is that correct?
I would like to submit a copy of the SAVE Act for
Pl-
everyone
Yeah,
present.
please share that with Ms. Jackson, and we'll share it with the committee. Thank you for your input, Ms. Cruz. Victor Tripp, Mr. Tripp, we're glad you're here. Thank you for your perseverance.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Senators. I'm Victor Tripp of DeKalb County, and I'm here in favor of the bill. A lot of time and energy has been spent debating the merits of some version of RCV, and I think it's time to suspend the debate. My reason to ban RCV is that it would be a huge disruption of a system that is already riddled with serious problems. I would be glad to return to the RCV debate when we have a system that inspires confidence to start with. As it is, we have a system that fewer and fewer Georgia citizens trust because more and more problems are being discovered. In this state, we have paper ballots that must be preserved for 2 years so that elections can be audited. CISA of the Department of Homeland Security says it's critical to, quote, conduct rigorous post-election tabulation audits of the physical ballots and paper records, unquote. A rigorous audit must be an independent audit. However, an independent audit is impossible when no ballot access is allowed. Internal audits have been shown to not match the original, and in some cases, there is no evidence that an audit was even done. The SOS office says the audit matched perfectly, and Judge Totenberg says that office is, quote, not credible, unquote. Then the SOS and the AG go to court to prevent.
Would please focus your comments on SB 355.
Okay, well, I will sum it up then by saying this mess has to be cleaned up before we even think about something as complex and controversial as RCV.
Thank you for your input. Any questions? Thank you, Mr. Tripp. Ms. Lee, Gail Lee. We welcome your input.
Thank you. I agree with, I'm Gail Lee and I live in DeKalb County. I agree with SB 355 as it's written, and I thank those of you who have sponsored it. Ranked choice voting is too complicated and it disenfranchises voters because ballots that do not include the 2 ultimate finalists are cast aside to manufacture a false majority for the winner. It reminds me of the game of musical chairs, which is no way to select those who will make decisions over our lives. A ranked choice election will, in the end, boil down to only 2 opposing candidates. But many voters will not have cast ballots deciding between those 2 choices. The voter ends up with no say in the contest between the final 2. Of course, had that election been a traditional runoff between those same 2 leading candidates, that voter would have had an opportunity to hear debates listen to the issues discussed, and make an informed choice between them. There are at least two alternatives to ranked choice voting, and one is the runoff system that we currently have. The added time window gives potential voters the opportunity to re-examine and re-educate themselves about the character and views on issues of the two candidates who received the largest pluralities in the general election. Voters have a greater opportunity to make an informed choice than with ranked choice voting. Runoff elections guarantee that the winner of the runoff election has a genuine mandate from a majority of the voters, which is a crucial factor in a democratic system. Another possibility for an alternative is in a contest among three or more candidates, the one who garners the most votes and exceeds 40% or another specified percent of the votes wins. If none reach the level of support specified, our current runoff system is triggered. I personally think we should seriously consider such an alternative. Anyway, in my last few seconds, I'd like to say I have prepared a list of things that I think need to be fixed about SB 202, and I'd like to pass it out to you if it's okay.
SB 202 is not the topic of discussion this evening.
Right.
SB 202 is law. There will be following legislation that may deal with those issues, but we defer your input until that time.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Well, we've completed the input. I'm grateful for those who came and shared. I'm going to recognize the senator from the 29th to close his presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to remind each committee member, there is a packet in your notebook. If you would look, there are letters of support for this legislation from the Opportunity Solutions Project, Voter Reference Foundation, Restoration of America, Save Our States, American Constitutional Right Union Action Fund, Illinois Conservative Union, Tea Party Patriots Action, Center for Election Confidence, Capital Research Center, Election Transparency Initiative, AMAC Action, Heartland Impact, Honest Elections Project, Honest Elections Project Action, Ranked Choice Education Association, Tea Party Patriots Action, Virginia Institute, Election Integrity Network, America First Policy Institute, Georgia, America First Works, and America First Policy Institute. And our good friend Austin Smith, who is an Arizona State Representative who's dealt with this in the past, and he proudly represents District 29 in Arizona. And so please feel free to research this, and I thank the committee for considering this legislation to do pass.
Thank you, Mr. Whip. What is the will of the committee?
So moved.
I have a motion from the senator from the 16th. Thank you very much. To do pass. Do I have a second? I have a second from Senator from the 50th. Thank you very much. All those in favor of the motion to do pass SB 355 indicate with the uplifted hand. All those opposed? That's quite unusual. Is that a question there, Senator?
I did have a,
Well, they say I've got to clarify the vote first. I think I saw it both ways. I'm not sure.
well, that's why I was trying to, I didn't want to yell point of order, but, you went from, calling the question to skipping over the discussion.
You know what? Point of order is indeed in order, sir. Do you have a question before, for the author?
I do.
All right.
Would the majority party whip, the senator from the 29th, agree on a compromise to lowering the threshold to 45%?
That question.
That's not a part of, or germane to this bill, Senator.
It's not germane to this bill. That question has been asked to me earlier, and I'll be happy to have a conversation, but 50+1 is where I stand on that. Thank you.
All right, I believe I saw a vote. Is that correct?
Yeah.
I did. So, and I believe I saw a unanimous vote in support of do pass on 355. Is that correct?
I'm a no.
We will revise that. There was one no vote, and I believe it would be about 9 yays. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 yay. 8 yay, 1 no. Thank you very much. The bill is recommended do pass. I'm going to ask Vice Chairman Williams if he will assume the chair so that I can provide you with a much shorter discussion of SB 358.
Like a motion to order dinner. We're gonna vote dinner.
I think the majority part ought to provide dinner.
That's right.
Okay, we'll move right on. We'll recognize Chairman Burns to present your bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a straightforward bill, SB 358. We're working from committee substitute LC 472735. 472735S. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. This bill does two very important things. It clarifies the responsibility of the state election board in its oversight role. If you maintain an awareness of what's going on in the state election board, in the December meeting of the state election board, there was some discussion about whether or not the board had responsibility and oversight of the Secretary of State and the office of the Secretary of State and their elections division. They split on that 2-2. Subsequent to that December 19th meeting, we received communication through a member of the state election board and then the chair of the state election board. So the chair of the state election board, in a letter to the Honorable John Burns, Speaker of the House, and the Honorable Burt Jones, Lieutenant Governor of Georgia, requested that legislation clarify the responsibility of the state election board and its role in oversight. And that's the reason that I bring you SB 358. You will notice it does two things. First of all, it removes the Secretary of State from being an ex officio member of the state election board. Again, if you're a casual observer, you will note that currently the Secretary of State does not actively participate in those proceedings, and I'm not aware of his attending their meetings on a routine basis or even on a casual basis. So there's really no reason for the Secretary of State to maintain an ex officio position. So that's section 1. And the other thing in section 1 that is important is on line 25, that it allows the state election board to conduct necessary investigations, so that with the approval of the board, they can employ and fix the compensation of personnel, including investigators, to determine, to assist the executive director in his and her duties. So in the past, the state election board has had to rely on the Secretary of State for investigations. They will continue to do so, but they now have authority to do their own investigations as well. And then finally, this legislation ensures that the Secretary of State is administratively, the state election board has administrative oversight for the Secretary of State and local elected officials, and it ensures that the Secretary of State provide cooperation with the state election board. Now, subsequent to this legislation being submitted and with the knowledge that we were having a hearing here today, I received a letter from the Office of the Secretary of State challenging whether or not this legislation was constitutional. I'm not an attorney. I'm simply making this as making the committee aware of this concern. I invited the Secretary of State to come and share their concerns with the committee. I don't know if they are here today, but I did ask our legislative counsel, who assisted in the drafting of the bill, to prepare a response to that challenge. And if the chair would allow it, I'd like to ask Mr. Morelli to kind of share with you his perspective of whether or not the legislature can authorize the state election board to have oversight responsibilities for the Secretary of State.
Okay, Mr. Morelli, thank you.
As Chairman Burns stated, he did provide me with a copy of the letter provided to him by the Secretary of State's office, where they raised potential constitutional objections to Senate Bill 358. And the basis of the arguments raised in this letter is referencing back to an opinion that the Attorney General's office issued back in 2005, when a similar issue came up as to whether or not the state election board could investigate the Secretary of State or the Secretary of State's office. At that time, the Attorney General opined that there was nothing in Georgia law that seemed to indicate that the that the state election board had the authority to investigate the Secretary of State's office, and the law as written at the time envisioned much more of a cooperative role between the Secretary of State's office and the state election board. What I will note is that the laws governing the state election board and the Secretary of State have changed a couple of times since 2005. One of the key points that the Attorney General made in his 2005 opinion was that it did not make sense for the state election board, which was at that time chaired by the Secretary of State, to investigate the Secretary of State himself. As the committee is aware, the Secretary of State is no longer the chair of the state election board, so that rationale in the opinion probably is not as of much concern anymore. The next position that the Attorney General seemed to focus on was that there was no clear authorization in the state law for the election board to investigate the Secretary of State's office. And that matter would be addressed by the proposed legislation of Senate Bill 358. Finally, the Attorney General did point out that there are some unanswered questions as to the ability of the state election board to have oversight over the Secretary of State, since the Secretary of State's office is an office established by the Constitution, and the Constitution provides certain duties to the Secretary of State's office. At this point, I will concur with the Attorney General that it is still probably an open question under Georgia constitutional law. There is no clear interpretation of the separation of powers doctrine as it relates here, but there is nothing in Senate Bill 358, which I'm aware of, that directly contravenes any of the interpretations of the separation of powers clause that the Supreme Court has handed down over the past 200 some odd years. The constitutional duties that the Secretary of State have would not be affected by the provisions of Senate Bill 358. The limited duties that the Constitution does provide to the Secretary of State would still remain within the purview of the Secretary of State's office. Most of the references to the Secretary of State in the Constitution are actually duties placed upon other officials to provide documentation to the Secretary of State. And then there is also a duty for the Secretary of State to coordinate with the Attorney General and Legislative Council to prepare summaries of proposed constitutional amendments. If the Secretary failed to undertake that duty, since it arises out of the Constitution, nothing in this legislation would authorize the State Election Board to investigate that failure, because the provisions of the State Election Board, the State Election Board is limited to enforcing the provisions of the Georgia Election Code, the statutory law, Chapter 2 of Title 21. So any constitutional duties the Secretary of State may have in elections would not be subject to investigation, but my review of the Constitution, as well as the provisions listed by the Attorney General in the 2005 opinion, list only a handful of roles that the Secretary of State plays in elections that are constitutional, not statutory.
Thank you, Mr. Morelli. I believe we got some questions. I don't know if they're for you or
I'm up. Hey. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to Chairman Burns. My question is in relation to the constitutionality of this. We tried in creating statute in my time in the House when we had a labor commissioner that was absent, Commissioner Butler, and we created a chief labor officer and passed out of the House and the Senate that was ultimately vetoed by Governor Brian Kemp because it violated the state's constitution, because that person was duly elected as a constitutional officer. And I remember that chief labor officer only had to do two things: go review the audit and to provide legislative responses to the inquiries. And it was vetoed by the governor's an unconstitutional bill that was an overreach to a constitutional officer elected by the state. And this seems to be headed down the same path. So my question, Chairman, is, has the governor's office or the governor's floor leader weighed in as to this bill?
Thank you for the question. I'll defer to the governor's floor leader. No, I will say the governor certainly has his prerogative. If he feels that this bill is unconstitutional, he can so note. But I believe that it's clear that legislation has granted the Secretary of State with most of the authority he currently has. And this bill simply takes the oversight ability and vests it within the state election board. Again, this is not an unconstitutional act. It's an act of the legislature to ensure the state election board has oversight authority. This bill does three things. It removes the Secretary of State from the board, not even as an effect ex officio. It allows the state election board to have oversight for the Secretary of State's responsibilities as it relates to elections, and it provides the state election board with investigative powers.
Senator Harper.
Senator Harper.
Yes, sir.
Sorry.
Senator Burns,
Senator
thank
from
you.
the 16th. Sorry.
You did, yes. Thank you for the bill. I think it makes a lot of sense with the issues that we've had over elections to have an election board with power to do some things. I have a question for you in the area of investigations.
Yes.
In that you and I have had conversations in many areas about the power and the funding is what I would look at. The number one is the funding capabilities or the funding money for this to give them the power to investigate. And what power do those investigators have from a standpoint of, can they subpoena? Can they request documents? Does that need to be broadened? When you say investigator, what powers do they have and where would they derive those powers from?
Right now, they would conduct the investigations as designated by the state election board. I don't presume to have that detail available. I would suggest that the state election board will make by rule those responsibilities. I think the most important thing is the state election board currently has no way to independently investigate any allegations of the Secretary of State or any of his staff or any local election officials. And if you look at lines 31 and 32, it specifically says that the state election board has the authority to investigate the Secretary of State and local election officials. Now, they would still work, I would say, for the majority of their investigations through the Secretary of State, but they would have the power to investigate independently.
Yeah, funding for this.
Funding of this will have to certainly come through appropriations.
Okay.
And we're in discussions with, depending upon the results of this legislation, what resources the state election board would need. I believe we have a vote on a new state election board chairman pending in the Senate, as well as a new member of the state election board. So we're looking at an opportunity to empower the state election board so that they can have oversight responsibility, and that there's no confusion about where that oversight responsibility is vested.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yes, sir. My question's for the Legislative Council.
this may surprise some of our members on this committee, but I read the Georgia Constitution and I looked at it again today. I can't find anywhere in the Georgia Constitution that gives the power to operate and run the elections to the Secretary of State. I'm looking at Article 2 under voting and elections, Section 1, Paragraph 1, and it appears that the elections are to be done by secret ballot, and the procedures that will be conducted will be in accordance with procedures provided by law. And then it talks about Paragraph 1, Section 2 under general provisions, again, that the General Assembly will provide by law for a method of the appeals and so forth. But nowhere in the document that I've read does it indicate that the Secretary of State is responsible for conducting the elections. Can you comment on that?
You are correct that the Constitution does say that the elections will be conducted in accordance with procedures by law. I will also point out, though, Article 2, Section 2, Paragraph 1 of the Constitution does provide, and the last sentence, I'll read it, that the General Assembly shall provide by law for procedures whereby returns of all elections by the people shall be made to the Secretary of State. So at the very least, the Constitution does provide a role of for the Secretary of State as receiving the returns of all elections conducted in the state.
But those procedures would be determined by state law, which would be by passing of general legislation. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Just follow up, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have a question as relates to the Secretary of State having investigative power. Many of you may recall now Governor Brian Kemp was Secretary of State that investigated those 12 folks in Quitman County and then related those charges to a criminal prosecution in which those charges have now been dropped. Under what authority was then Secretary of State Brian Kemp operating under to have that investigative power?
I'm not privy to that that particular case, and I wouldn't presume to speak for the Secretary of State at that time, Mr. Kemp, or the current governor. I would say that currently the Secretary of State has an investigations division, and that they do routinely pursue allegations of voter irregularities. I would suggest that the Secretary of State in his office has no oversight, and that's what this bill is about. This bill is not necessarily targeted at direct voter allegations or voter irregularity allegations. It's targeted at the ability of the state election board to provide reasonable oversight over the elections responsibilities that the Secretary of State has been legislatively provided.
Well, that's why I was trying to understand, Mr. Chairman, and maybe my public school education not let me fathom it. So if the counties are only supposed to supply to the Secretary of State the information, and if there's any malfeasance, then he has a division in his office that would do the investigations. So who would the investigators of the state election board be investigating if
They could investigate either allegations that perhaps the elections division of the Secretary of State has not pursued, or they could pursue investigations associated with irregularities of the Secretary of State's office, so that there's reasonable oversight. We're not out there on a witch hunt looking for problems. We're out there to provide reasonable oversight of a very critical process that impacts every citizen in Georgia.
And my final question, would that not be a function of the Georgia Bureau of Investigation?
They could and have been called in to assist in the investigations of voting irregularities. But I will also say that the Secretary of State's elections investigation division is generally the primary lead on that responsibility. They could call in the GBI if necessary and as appropriate, realizing in every case where there is probable cause, the allegations are referred to the Attorney General, or they're referred to the district attorney within that jurisdiction.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
What I have witnessed in the past, from my experience, would be the Secretary of State's investigative division would investigate the allegations of irregularities in elections, and then they would turn that over to the state election board, and they would actually meet and they would take action.
But is it not true, Mr. Chairman, that the state election board acts on the recommendations of the investigators of the Secretary of State?
That is correct.
And when the Secretary of State's investigation needs to be supplemented, currently the state election board does not have that capacity?
That is right. Do you have a question?
No, sir, you asked a question, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you. Yes, sir.
Isn't it true, Chairman Burns, that none of these powers that we're talking about are in the Constitution? They're all in general law that the Georgia General Assembly has passed over the course of time in our state history. So we can change them, amend them in any way we want through the legislative process.
That is my understanding, Senator.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the board? Will of the committee? Senator Robertson?
Mr. Chairman, I make a motion do pass.
Have a second, from Senator Harbin.
Yeah, committee sub.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman. Motion do pass by committee sub. The LC I'm reading off of is LC 472735 Sierra.
Thank you. Second, Senator Gooch. Okay. Any discussion? We have a motion, and a second. Any discussion?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, to the concept of this bill, it seems that we're creating another investigative body, wasting precious taxpayer money that could be allocated to other agencies.
Any other member? All in favor, say aye. Any opposed?
Opposed.
So carry. That concludes our meeting. You want to adjourn it? Our meeting will be adjourned.